The screaming started before the riders even appeared on the horizon. It carried through the walls of Samarkand like smoke. Thin at first, then thick, then suffocating. The merchants in the bazaars heard it. The scribes in the libraries heard it. The children playing near the man who wiped out entire mosques, heard it. And every single one of them understood. Civilizations with a cold and absolute certainty what that sound meant. The Mongols had come. It was the year 1220 of the Common Era. Samarkand was not a small town, not some forgotten village on the edge of the known world. It was one of the most magnificent cities on the face of the earth, a jewel of the Islamic world, a center of scholarship, trade, and culture, home to hundreds of thousands of souls. Its walls were vast. Its garrison was Urs. Its sultan had once called himself the ruler of the greatest empire between the Caspian Sea and the mountains of the Hindu Kush. And yet, as the dust clouds rose on the horizon and the thunder of 100,000 hooves rolled across the steppe like a tide coming in, the defenders of Samarkand felt something they had not expected to feel: helplessness. The gates held for 3 days. 3 days of arrows so thick they darkened the afternoon sun. 3 days of Mongol horsemen circling the walls like wolves, probing, testing, never committing to a direct assault, wearing down the nerves of every man standing watch. And then, on the 4th day, something broke. Not the walls, the will of the men behind them. Units of the garrison began to surrender. Then came the defections, the quiet opening of a secondary gate, the collapse of coordination and command. And when the Mongol riders finally poured through the breach, it was not like a battle. It was like a flood. It was like something of nature, indifferent and unstoppable. The libraries burned. The gardens burned. The caravanserais and the palaces and the workshops of the nest artisans in Central Asia, all of it burned. The population that survived was sorted. Craftsmen and engineers were kept. Scholars sometimes spared. Soldiers slaughtered. And those who had resisted most earthly were made examples of in ways that history has recorded in all their terrible detail. Eyewitnesses later wrote that the streets ran with blood. They were not writing poetry. They meant it literally. And behind all of it, the strategy, the terror, the calculated and merciless precision was one man. A man who had been born with nothing. A man who had grown up as a slave in all but name. Who had once been left on the open steppe to die by his own people. A man whose name in the decades after Samarkand would become the most feared word in every language from China to the gates of Europe. His name was Temujin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. If you want to understand how a man born into total poverty and abandonment became the conqueror of nearly a quarter of the world's land surface, stay right here. And if history like this moves you, hit that like button now. It helps more people find stories like this one. To understand Genghis Khan, you have to understand the world that made him. And that world was brutal in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. The steppes of Mongolia in the 12th century were not a place of peace or stability. They were a vast, wind-scoured landscape of grass and stone and bitter cold, inhabited by tribes that lived on horseback, herded animals, and survived by raiding one another with a ferocity born of necessity. There was no central authority, no written law, no single ruler. There was only the clan, your family, your people, and everyone outside your clan was a potential enemy. Temujin was born sometime around 1162 on the banks of the Onan River in what is now northern Mongolia. His father was a man named Yesugei, a minor chief of the Borjigin clan, respected enough to be considered a leader, but far from powerful in the larger sense. His mother was Holan, a woman of Urs intelligence and formidable will, who had herself been abducted from another tribe by Yesugei on the very day of her first marriage. This was not unusual on the steppe. This was simply how things were done. Temujin came into the world gripping a blood clot in his tiny first. The shamans who examined the newborn said it was a sign, a portent of a warrior's destiny. Whether or not they believed it in the moment, history would eventually make their prophecy seem like understatement. He was named Temujin after a rival chieftain his father had just defeated in battle, as was the Mongol custom. to honor a victory by giving his trophy name to a son. His childhood was not gentle. The steppe demanded hardness from its children in the same way it demanded everything else, immediately and without apology. Boys learned to ride before they could walk properly. They learned to draw a bow before their arms were strong enough to do it well. They learned to endure cold, to sleep in the open, to travel vast distances without complaint, and to understand that weakness, in any form, invited destruction. Temujin absorbed all of this. He was, by most accounts, a serious and watchful child, observant, quiet, storing what he saw behind pale, keen eyes. Then, when he was approximately 9 years old, everything changed. Yasuge rode out with young Temujin, too, and the boy a future bride, a common practice, the visiting of a neighboring clan to arrange a childhood betrothal. On the return journey, Yasuge stopped to eat and drink with a group of Tatars, a neighboring tribe with whom his clan had a long and complicated hostility. The Tatars recognized him, and they poisoned his food. Yasuge made it home. He died 3 days later. Temujin was 9 years old, his brothers were younger still, and his family was now, in the brutal calculus of steppe politics, almost entirely without protection. What followed would have destroyed most people. Literally, the clan, Yasuge's own clan, the people Temujin's father had led, abandoned the family. They left Holun and her children on the open steppe with almost no animals, almost no supplies, and no allies. The reasoning was clear and cold. A widow with young children was a liability, not an asset. Feeding them drained resources that could support warriors, and warriors were what mattered on the steppe. Holun refused to die. She led her children along riverbanks, digging up roots, catching small animals, scraping sustenance out of a landscape that offered almost nothing. She told her children stories of their lineage, of ancestors who had been great, of blood that carried significance, of a future that was not yet written. She kept them alive through sheer force of will, and in doing so she forged in young Temujin something that no comfort could have created, an absolute, bone-deep understanding that survival was not given. It was taken. It was fought for. It was won. The family's isolation was not merely economic hardship. It was danger. On the steppe, people without a powerful patron could be raided, enslaved, or killed with little consequence. And it happened. A rival clan, the Taichut, rode to Temujin's family camp and took the young boy captive. They placed a wooden kangue around his neck, a heavy yoke that prevented him from sleeping easily, from moving freely, from anything but submission. He was held as a prisoner, a slave in all practical senses, moved from guerre to guerre among the Taichut families like a piece of property. He escaped. The details of his escape are part legend, part credible history. He knocked a guard unconscious with the very kangue they had locked around his neck, hid in a river with only his face above the waterline, and was helped by a family of modest standing within the Taichut who saw something in the boy worth protecting. Whether the details are perfectly accurate hardly matters. What matters is the result. Temujin survived. He escaped. An escape in his circumstances was an act of extraordinary will and cunning. By the time Temujin was a teenager, he was beginning to move again in the world. He retrieved his betrothed, a young woman named Berta, from the Conquerat clan, the girl his father had arranged for him years before, and the two were married. Berta came with a valuable wedding gift, a sable fur cloak. It was not a trivial thing. On the steppe, such a gift was currency, status, alliance-building material. And Temujin knew immediately what to do with it. He rode to Antogrol, the powerful Khan of the Karite tribe, who had been a sworn blood brother to his father. He presented the cloak as a tribute and a message. I am my father's son. I ask for your protection and alliance. Togrul accepted. This was Temujin's first major political move, and it showed, even at his young age, a quality that would define his entire career. The ability to identify what a more powerful person valued, to offer it precisely and without hesitation, and to bind them to his cause through a transaction both sides found meaningful. The fragile piece of his new life shattered almost immediately. The Merkits, a tribe that had never forgiven the original abduction of Holun by Yasuge decades before, came in force and took Burta. It was a revenge raid, deliberate and pointed, and Temujin's response to it revealed for the first time publicly the combination of traits that would make him extraordinary. He did not lash out in blind anger, and he did not accept the loss. He organized. He built a coalition, calling on Togrul and on his sworn blood brother, Yamuka, a brilliant and charismatic leader of the Jadaran clan who had known Temujin since childhood. Together, they rode against the Merkits with a force large enough to be decisive, and they destroyed them. Burta was recovered. Their first child was born shortly after, under circumstances that raised questions about paternity that Temujin never publicly acknowledged. He raised the boy, Yochi, as his own. That decision, quiet and deliberate, told a great deal about the kind of man Temujin was becoming. Pragmatic, controlled, unwilling to let personal wounds become strategic liabilities. The alliance with Jamuka was more complicated. The two men were genuinely close. The historical sources describe them exchanging gifts, sleeping under the same blanket as sworn brothers in the Mongol tradition of Anda. Close companions bonded by oath. But they were also rivals in the deepest sense. Both were leaders of growing followings. Both had charisma, intelligence, and ambition, and their visions for what power on the steppe should look like were fundamentally different. Jamuka was a man of the old order. He believed in the aristocracy of birth, in the hierarchy of noble lineages, in the traditional structures that governed Mongol society. He was brilliant within that framework, but he could not see beyond it. Temujin was building something else entirely. He promoted men based on ability and loyalty rather than birth. He rewarded those who served him well, regardless of their clan origins. He created a personal following, an inner circle called the Nukur, or companions, that was bound to him personally rather than to any clan structure. This was radical, this was revolutionary, and it drew people to him with a force that traditional clan loyalty simply could not match. The break between Temujin and Jamuka came, as such breaks almost always do, gradually and then all at once. Jamuka united a coalition of tribes against Temujin in a conflict around 1187. Temujin was defeated, one of his very few military losses, and forced to scatter his forces and retreat. But the defeat did not break him. If anything, it clarified his understanding of what he needed to build. Not a larger version of what already existed, but something structurally different. A military machine that was organized around loyalty, discipline, and a chain of command rather than tribal identity. Subscribe to this channel if you're not already. We go deep on history's most fascinating figures, and this story is just getting started. The next 20 years of Temujin's life are about to transform everything you thought you knew about conquest and power. Over the following decade, Temujin rebuilt. He fought, he negotiated, he absorbed defeated enemies into his own forces, a practice almost unheard of on the steppe, where defeated enemies were typically enslaved or killed. He offered them a choice: join him, serve him, follow his code, and you will be treated as equals. Reject him and face the consequences. Most chose to join, and with each addition to his force, his capacity for the next campaign grew. He waged war against the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father, and when he defeated them, he enacted a policy of annihilation that was at once personally motivated and strategically rational. He ordered that every Tatar male taller than the linchpin of a wagon wheel be killed. Children below that height were spared and absorbed into Mongol families. Women were taken as wives or servants. It was ruthless, and it was ancient. Within a generation, the Tatar tribe as a distinct entity would cease to exist. Their identity would be dissolved into the growing Mongol whole. He defeated the Naimans. He defeated the Merkits again, permanently this time. He turned against Togrul when the Genghis Khan, pressured by his own nobles and frightened by Temujin's growing power, moved against him. The war against Togrul was not one Temujin wanted. The older man had been a patron and an ally, but when it came, Temujin fought it with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything else. He won. The Karaite tribe was absorbed, and now he turned to Jamuka, the last great rival on the Mongolian steppe. the man who had once been his closest friend. Their Nal confrontation was less a battle than a completion. Jamuka's coalition crumbled, his men deserted him, and eventually he was captured and brought before Temujin. The two men faced each other one last time. By several accounts, Temujin offered his old companion mercy if he would submit. Jamuka refused. He asked for a noble death, without the shedding of blood, as batted a man of high birth. Temujin granted it. Jamuka was executed by having his back broken, bloodlessly in the Mongol fashion reserved for those of high status. There was no one left on the Mongolian steppe who could challenge him. In 1206, at a great gathering of all the Mongol tribes on the banks of the Onon River, the same river where Temujin had been born, a Kurultai was held. A grand assembly, all the tribal leaders, all the great warriors, all the shamans and elders and men of standing, gathered in a place described as led with white felt gurs stretching as far as the eye could see, with the nine-tailed white banner of supreme authority planted at the center. And from that assembly, the man who had been born with nothing, who had escaped slavery and survived abandonment and outlasted every rival, rose to the title of Genghis Khan, a name whose precise meaning is debated by scholars, but which most interpret as something close to universal ruler or ruler of the ocean, evoking the idea of a dominion without shores. He was not a young man anymore. He was, by most estimates, in his mid-40s. He had spent his entire adult life in preparation for a moment he may not have consciously imagined, but which he had made inevitable through every decision, every alliance, every battle, every act of calculated mercy and calculated brutality. He was Genghis Khan, and the world had not yet begun to understand what that meant. The army that Genghis Khan had built was not like any force the world had seen before. To call it simply an army undersells it. It was a system, an organism, that had been designed from worst principles by a man who understood war not as a series of engagements, but as a total practice, encompassing logistics, intelligence, psychology, and command structure in ways that most other military cultures of the era had barely begun to conceptualize. The foundation was the decimal system. Every soldier in the Mongol army belonged to a unit of 10, called an arban. 10 arbans formed a jagan of 100. 10 jagans formed a mingan of 1,000. 10 mingans formed a tumen of 10,000, the great operational division of the Mongol military. Every man knew his unit, his commander, and his place in the chain. Every commander at every level was responsible absolutely for the men under him, for their equipment, their readiness, their discipline, their performance in battle. Failure of a unit meant consequences for its commander, consistently without exception. This structure gave the Mongol army a quality almost unique in the medieval world: the ability to execute complex, coordinated maneuvers across distances of dozens or even hundreds of miles simultaneously. Communication between units was managed by a relay system of riders, the yam, that allowed messages to travel faster across the steppe than any enemy could move troops. Genghis Khan could command a battle on a front that stretched beyond any single person's ability to see, and his orders would reach every wing, every reserve unit, every hashtag within hours. The warriors themselves were extraordinary. Every Mongol man was a horseman before he was anything else, having spent his entire life on the back of the small, tough, seemingly inexhaustible horses of the steppe. The composite bow that Mongol archers carried was a marvel of engineering, a recurved weapon made from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, capable of driving an arrow through armor at distances other cultures' bows could not match, and small enough to be read from horseback at full gallop. A trained Mongol horse archer could or at least 10 aim shots per minute in the saddle. He could do it while riding away from the enemy at full speed. The famous Parthian shot, perfected and systematized. He could do it in cold that froze the dangers of less hardened men. Each warrior typically maintained between 3 and horses on campaign. This was crucial. It meant that the activo speed of a Mongol army was not limited by the endurance of a single horse, but by the endurance of a herd. Mongol forces could cover 60 to 100 miles in a single day's march under the right conditions, a speed that made their movements seem almost supernatural to enemies who were trying to predict and react to them on foot or with slower cavalry. The army also carried, from early in its development, captured engineers and artillerists from the civilizations it had defeated. When Genghis Khan's forces encountered the walled cities of northern China, they did not shy away. They learned. They recruited Chinese engineers who understood siege warfare, who knew how to build trebuchets, mangonels, and battering rams, who understood how to undermine walls and collapse gates, who could direct the systematic reduction of any fortification that could be built. The nomadic horde that some enemies imagined as capable only of open, held battle became, within years, one of the most sophisticated siege warfare forces in the world. But perhaps the most devastating weapon in the Mongol arsenal was not physical at all. It was psychological. Genghis Khan understood, with the intuition of genius, that an enemy who surrenders without hiding is an enemy who costs you nothing. And he cultivated his army's reputation as the most terrible force in the world with the deliberateness of a man who understood that reputation itself was a weapon. The system was simple and publicly known. A city that surrendered immediately and cooperated fully would be spared. Its people would live. Trade would continue. Mongol administrators would install themselves and collect taxes, but daily life would go on. A city that resisted but eventually fell would face harsher terms. Executions of soldiers and officials, population reductions, but survival for those who cooperated. A city that resisted to the end, that fought with everything it had and made the Mongols pay for every inch. That city would be an example. Total, absolute, a message written in ash and bone for every other city within hearing distance. This policy was not accidental cruelty, it was strategy. And it worked so effectively that in campaign after campaign, cities opened their gates before the first arrow was fired. Defenders argued to their commanders that resistance was pointless, that they had heard what happened to those who fought. The reputation of Genghis Khan's army preceded it like a shadow falling before a storm. And in that shadow, the will to resist often died before the battle began. If you've made it this far, you already know this is something special. Like this video and subscribe. The next part of this story covers the campaigns that changed the face of the known world forever. You won't want to miss it. The first great test of the unified Mongol military machine against a major settled civilization came in northern China. The Xia kingdom fell first, a Tangut state of considerable power, sophisticated enough to maintain large armies and fortified cities. Genghis Khan's forces struck it in a series of campaigns beginning around 1205, probing, learning, forcing the Xia to acknowledge Mongol supremacy and pay tribute. But it was the Jin dynasty of northern China, the empire of the Yurchen people who had ruled the region for nearly a century, that offered he first truly vast, sophisticated, and resistant opponent. The Jin Empire was enormous, its population numbered in the tens of millions. It had armies of hundreds of thousands. It had the Great Wall, or portions of it, along with numerous other fortifications. It had cavalry, professional soldiers, experienced commanders, and the full weight of a mature, bureaucratic state behind it. When Genghis Khan turned his forces south toward the Jin in 1211, most observers, including probably many of the Jin's own commanders, would have expected a punishing but ultimately limited raid. The kind of border incursion that the steppe had always delivered and that China had always eventually absorbed and repelled. What happened instead was something else entirely. The Mongol forces did not behave like raiders. They behaved like conquerors. They moved methodically through the Jin's northern territories, taking city after city, adapting their tactics to each new obstacle, incorporating captured Jin soldiers and engineers into their forces as they advanced. The psychological terror they brought with them was total. Populations fled ahead of them. Armies collapsed before contact in some cases. Commanders who had spent decades in military service found themselves facing an enemy that had no pattern they recognized. The Jin capital of Zhongdu, roughly where modern Beijing stands, fell after a prolonged siege in 1215. The fall of Zhongdu sent tremors through the entire Eurasian world. China was the greatest civilization on earth in terms of population, wealth, and material sophistication, and its northern capital had been taken by the horsemen of the steppe. The message was received across thousands of miles. But even as the Jin campaign ground on, it would ultimately take decades to complete. Nished by Genghis Khan's successors after his death, Genghis Khan's attention was pulled in a different direction, west, to a confrontation that would become, arguably, the single most destructive event in the medieval world, the collision with the Khwarezmian Empire. The Khwarezmian Empire in the early 13th century was the dominant power of the Islamic world east of Mesopotamia. At its height, it stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the edges of India to the borders of the Caucasus. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, was powerful, proud, and had recently completed his own campaign of expansion that had made him, in his own estimation and that of his contemporaries, something close to the greatest Islamic ruler of the age. Genghis Khan's initial approach to the Khwarezmian Empire was not military, it was commercial. He sent a trade caravan of 450 merchants and envoys with enormous wealth, carrying a message that was essentially an offer of peaceful trade and mutual recognition. The message was unambiguous. Genghis Khan considered the Shah a great ruler, desired trade between their empires, and wished for peaceful relations. By most interpretations of the historical evidence, this was genuine. The Mongol Empire needed trade access to Western markets. War would have been costly and uncertain. A diplomatic solution benefited both sides. The Shah made a catastrophic error. The governor of the border city of Otrar, either acting on instructions from the Shah or on his own initiative, with the Shah's subsequent approval, had the entire trade delegation arrested. The merchants were accused of spying. They were executed. Their goods were confiscated. Genghis Khan's response was measured at first. He sent an official diplomatic mission to demand explanation and reparations. The Shah had the Mongol ambassador killed and sent the others back with their beards shaved off, an act of supreme insult in the Mongol cultural context, a dehumanizing humiliation directed at the Khan himself through his representatives. It is possible the Shah did not believe the reports of Mongol power he had received. It is possible he believed his own armies were sufficient to handle whatever came. It is possible he simply misjudged the man he was dealing with in every possible way. The Mongol response, when it came, was organized over nearly 2 years of meticulous preparation. Genghis Khan mustered somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors, one of the largest forces he had ever assembled, and moved them west with the deliberateness of a man who intended not merely to punish, but to obliterate. He sent scouts and intelligence gatherers ahead of his main force for months. He knew the geography of the Khwarezmian Empire in detail before a single Mongol soldier crossed its border. He knew where the major cities were, where the roads ran, where the defenses were weakest. He knew that Shah Muhammad had spread his forces across hundreds of garrisons, rather than concentrating them for a decisive field engagement. A fatal strategic error, born of the Shah's distrust of his own commanders, and his belief that his city walls would hold. The campaign that unfolded in 1219 and 1220 was a masterwork of operational art. Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple columns that struck simultaneously from different directions, denying the Shah any ability to concentrate his response. One of his generals, Jebe, led a rapid strike force that swept around the Shah's flank at terrifying speed. Another column under Genghis's son Yochi drove into the Sirdarya River Valley, and Genghis Khan himself led the main force through the Kizilkum Desert, a route considered impassable by the Khwarezmians, which is precisely why he chose it. The city of Otrar, where the merchants had been murdered, fell after a siege of several months. The governor who had ordered the massacre was captured alive. Genghis Khan had him executed by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. It was the only time in recorded history that the Khan personally ordered a death by this method. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a message, delivered with the specificity of a man who understood symbolism. Bukhara fell. The citizens emerged to see Genghis Khan ride into the great mosque. By one account, he addressed them from the pulpit, telling them that he was the punishment of God, that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment as great as him. Whether this speech is accurately recorded or embellished by later historians scarcely matters. The theology behind it, the idea that catastrophe on this scale required a divine instrument, was how medieval people processed what was happening to them. They needed a framework, and the framework they reached for was the wrath of heaven. Then came Samarkand, the city we began with, the city that had seemed, to those inside it, like a fortress capable of holding forever against anything the world could send. It held for 3 days. It burned for longer. Shah Muhammad II fled. He would spend the last months of his life as the most hunted man in the world. Genghis Khan detached two of his finest generals, Jebe and Subutai, with a force of approximately 20,000 riders, and gave them a mission almost unprecedented in the history of warfare. Pursue the Shah wherever he went. Do not stop. Do not rest significantly. Follow him until he is caught. The Shah died on a small island in the Caspian Sea of illness and despair before they caught him. But Jebe and Subutai did not turn around. With no further orders from Genghis Khan, they continued west, through Persia, through Azerbaijan, across the Caucasus, into the lands of the Cumans and Kipchaks, and eventually into the southern Russian steppe. They defeated a combined Rus and Cuman force at the Battle of the Sit River in 1223, with tactics so sophisticated and unexpected that the Rus commanders did not understand what had happened to them until it was over. Then Jebe and Subutai turned around, rode thousands of miles back east, and rejoined the main Mongol army. They had circumnavigated the Caspian Sea, fought and won engagements across half a continent, and lost almost no men of significance in doing so. It was perhaps the most extraordinary military reconnaissance expedition in history, and it gave the Mongol leadership a detailed understanding of every kingdom west of the Volga River, knowledge they would use in future campaigns with devastating effect. The Khwarezmian heartland, meanwhile, had been reduced to ruins. The great cities of the empire, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, Balkh, fell one after another. The scale of the destruction at some of these sites is a matter of genuine historical debate, with sources giving death tolls that range from the hundreds of thousands to the implausible. What is not in debate is that the Khwarezmian Empire ceased to exist as a functioning entity within 3 years of Genghis Khan's invasion. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture across vast regions were destroyed, and some of those agricultural systems would not fully recover for centuries. The demographic impact on Central Asia was severe enough to alter the ethnic and linguistic composition of entire regions permanently. The scale of it is almost impossible to hold in the mind. We reach for statistics and they slide off comprehension. Historians estimate that the Mongol conquest as a whole, across all campaigns under Genghis Khan and his successors, may have been responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 30 and 40 million people, accounting for a reduction in global population in the 13th century that would not be matched until the Black Death 100 years later. Some researchers working from demographic models suggest the Mongol conquest may have killed between 5 and 15% of the total human population alive at the time. The very air of Central Asia changed. Scholars have found evidence of cooling and reforestation in the archaeological record of the period, driven by the depopulation of agricultural lands that subsequently returned to grassland, sequestering carbon and briefly altering regional climate. The man had shaped the physical environment of the planet. We're now at the peak of the most devastating military campaign of the medieval era. If this documentary is hitting different for you, if you're seeing Genghis Khan in a new light, drop a comment below and hit subscribe. Every single like helps this channel keep making content at this level. But here is where the story becomes more complicated and more interesting than simple destruction. Because Genghis Khan was not only a destroyer, he was also in certain ways that sit uneasily alongside his record of devastation, a builder. And understanding that paradox is essential to understanding why his empire lasted, why his legacy persisted, and why the world he created was so genuinely transformative. From the earliest days of his rise to power, Genghis Khan had operated on a principle that was radical for his time and place. Ability mattered more than birth. The Mongol aristocracy of the old steppe world had been, like aristocracies everywhere, deeply invested in lineage, in the idea that the right to command was inherited along with blood. Genghis Khan dismantled that principle systematically. He promoted commanders based on their performance. He elevated men of low birth to positions of enormous authority when they demonstrated the qualities he valued: loyalty, courage, intelligence, and the ability to execute his vision. His greatest generals, men like Subutai, who would go on to be arguably the most tactically gifted military mind of the medieval world, came from backgrounds that in the old order would have kept them permanently subordinate. He created the Yasa, a code of laws that governed behavior within the Mongol Empire, with a comprehensiveness unusual for the era. The Yasa's specific provisions are known to us only partially, filtered through later sources and secondary accounts, since the original text has not survived. But from what is known, it covered an enormous range of conduct: the handling of disputes between individuals, the rules of war, the treatment of civilians, the obligations of soldiers, the punishments for theft and murder and adultery, the protocols for diplomatic relations. It was not a gentle code. Punishments were often severe, but it was applied consistently and without regard for social status. A nobleman who violated the Yasa faced the same consequences as a commoner. That consistency was itself a form of radical equality. The Mongol Empire also established something that would have an extraordinary impact on commerce and communication across Eurasia: the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Once a region was conquered and integrated, it became part of a vast network of protected roads, relay stations, and trade routes that stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Eastern Europe. Merchants who carried the gerej, the Mongol passport tablet, could travel this network in relative safety, protected by the authority of the Khan's name and the knowledge that attacking a traveler under Mongol protection was an offense that would be answered with overwhelming force. The volume of trade that moved along these routes during the Pax Mongolica was, by the standards of the era, staggering. Silk, spices, precious metals, manufactured goods, technologies, ideas, all of it flowed along the Great Silk Road with a freedom and security it had rarely known before. Merchants from Venice and Genoa made fortunes. Chinese technologies, paper money, printing, gunpowder, the compass, moved west along these routes. Islamic mathematics and astronomy moved east. The Mongol Empire, in this sense, was the greatest engine of globalization the world had yet seen. Religious tolerance was another hallmark of Genghis Khan's rule that defies easy categorization. He himself, by most accounts, maintained the traditional Mongol shamanism of the steppe, a relationship with the sky god Tengri and with the spiritual forces of nature that was the foundation of Mongol cosmology. But he was remarkably uninterested in imposing his own beliefs on those he conquered. His empire encompassed Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, Confucians, and practitioners of dozens of local traditions. Genghis Khan exempted religious figures and institutions of all faiths from taxation, invited scholars and religious leaders of every tradition to his court, and made a general practice of listening to theological arguments from all sides with what his attendants described as genuine curiosity. This was not merely tolerance in the passive sense. It was active engagement with the diversity of the world his conquests had delivered to him. At the same time, it would be dishonest to present this tolerance as purely principled. It was also strategic. A conquered population that could practice its faith without interference was less likely to revolt. Priests and monks and scholars who owed their safety to Mongol protection were useful allies in administering a vast and diverse empire. Enlightened self-interest and genuine openness are not mutually exclusive, and in Genghis Khan's case, they seem to have coexisted. The Datanal years of Genghis Khan's life were consumed by a return to the conflict that had defined much of his career. The campaign against the Xixia kingdom of northern China, which had failed to provide military support during the Khwarezmian campaign, as it was obligated to do by its status as a Mongol vassal. To Genghis Khan, this was not merely a political failure. It was a betrayal of oath. And the violation of oath, in the Mongol moral universe, was among the gravest offenses imaginable. He led the campaign personally, despite being in his 60s, old by the standards of his time and place, his body carrying the accumulated damage of 6 decades of brutal physical existence. He had survived multiple serious injuries, including wounds from arrows that should have killed lesser men. He was no longer the swift young warrior of his early campaigns, but he remained, by all accounts, a commanding and formidable presence. Tall for a Mongol, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that witnesses consistently described as penetrating and unsettling. During the Xixia campaign, in the summer of 1227, Genghis Khan died. The circumstances of his death are uncertain and have been debated for 8 centuries. Some accounts say he died of injuries sustained when his horse threw him. Others suggest illness, possibly a form of the typhus or bubonic infections that plagued military camps of the era. Some later sources contain more colorful stories, killed by a Shisha princess in a Dobotnal act of vengeance, or struck down by supernatural forces invoked by the enemies he had destroyed. These latter accounts are almost certainly legendary. The most credible accounts simply say he died of natural causes, illness and the accumulated attrition of a life lived entirely at the edge of human endurance. His death was kept secret until the Shisha campaign concluded. The campaign concluded with the destruction of the Shisha state, the royal family killed, the cities taken, the kingdom dissolved. His Nal wishes were honored. His last campaign was completed in his name before his death was announced to the world. He was buried somewhere in the mountains near his birthplace. The exact location of his tomb is one of history's enduring mysteries, deliberate by design. His orders were that his burial place should remain unknown, that no monument should mark it, that the earth should simply reclaim him as it had once received his ancestors. A great many people were reportedly killed to preserve the secret. The servants who carried his body, the soldiers who dug the grave, the riders who trampled the ground afterward to erase signs of passage. If the accounts are accurate, the secret has been kept for nearly 8 centuries. Archaeological surveys with modern technology have been conducted in the region. No confirmed burial site has been found. The empire he left behind was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, a title it holds to this day and likely always will. At its maximum extent under his successors, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China and Korea in the east to the Danube River in Europe in the west, from Siberia in the north to Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf in the south. It encompassed more than 24 million square kilometers, roughly the equivalent of the entire continent of Africa. It ruled over approximately 100 million people at a time when the total human population of the earth was perhaps 300 million. His sons and grandsons continued the expansion he had set in motion. His son Ogedei became Great Khan after a brief political struggle and pushed the empire's frontiers further still, into Korea, into southern China, and most dramatically into Eastern Europe, where an army under his nephew Batu and the genius General Subutai swept through Poland and Hungary in the winter of 1241, with a speed and devastation that sent shockwaves through the courts of Western Europe. The Mongol forces were defeated only indirectly, not on the Battle Eld, but by Ogedei's death in December 1241, which required Batu to withdraw and return east for the succession process. Europe was perhaps 100 miles from full invasion when a cup of wine killed the great Khan in his palace in Karakorum, and the army turned around. The pattern of his governance, the decimal military organization, the Yasa, the relay communication system, the promotion by merit, the religious tolerance, the protection of trade, was carried forward by his successors with varying degrees of fidelity. At its best, the Mongol Empire was a genuinely functional multicultural state, administering astonishing diversity through a combination of consistent law, efficient communication, and pragmatic tolerance. At its worst, it was a machine for extraction that could be brutal and arbitrary. Both things were true simultaneously. The empire was, like the man who founded it, a contradiction that resists simple summary.